This is Michael Graham, Managing Editor for InsideSources.com. We are proud to present this recording of our live discussion with advocates for restoring workers' rights and freedoms. The conversation was held on October 2nd at the Freedom Embassy of the Lansing offices of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. I had the pleasure of being the moderator, and you'll also hear from Jared Rodriguez. He's Executive Director of the Center for Independent Employees, along with Steve DeLee of the Mackinac Center, Shane Hernandez, President of the Associated Builders and Contractors of Michigan, and Terry Bowman, a former member of the United Auto Workers. We hope you'll enjoy this informative and interesting conversation hosted by InsideSources.com. Jared, would you mind introducing yourself and tell everybody what the Center for Independent Employees is about and this wonderful location you got us in here on the Inside Sources panel, our roundtable on Michigan, the law, and labor?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Michael, to Inside Sources for hosting us this morning. My name is Jared Rodriguez. I serve as the Executive Director of the Center for Independent Employees. CIE is the acronym that we use. CIE is a legal defense foundation that provides free legal aid to independent employees across this country that are opposed to unionization in their workplace. We are the organization that provides legal sound advice, campaign advice, but ultimately what we do is we work on decertifications for employees, and we only work for employees. Today and this morning, we are in the Freedom Embassy, which is a beautiful office space that was provided by the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, who has been intricately involved in some of the topics that we're going to talk about today. So I appreciate the opportunity, and we've got Terry Bowman, who is sitting on my right, Ford employee, but also UAW member. On my left here, we've got Shane Hernandez, who is the president of ABC Michigan, which is the Associated Builders and Contractors. And then on the other side of Shane, we've got Steve DeLee, who is with the Mackinac Center for Public Policy.
And one of the things that we've been covering at Inside Sources for years now is the issue of right to work, where the line should be. Michigan has a fascinating, I would argue it's a unique story. And I got to tell you, the timing of this gathering that CIE put together is fortuitous given what's happening on America's coasts, where you have Americans looking at a debate, a fight, if you will, between the power that labor unions have, the power that managers have, and the power that consumers have, and they all come together. And I look forward to hearing more about the big picture of what's happened in Michigan, which went from right to work to repealing your right to work law. But I want to start on the ground with Terry Bowman. You actually work for a living.
I do.
I'm very uncomfortable being this close to people who work for a living. As my father tells me all the time, somehow you manage to avoid hard work your entire life. And so tell me about your life as a worker here in Michigan, what you did and your life during the right to work and now the post right to work era.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you all for watching the stream, and thank you all for inviting me to be here. Sure. So I worked for Ford Motor Company for 28 years. And I come from a family that has worked for Ford for generations. My father worked for Ford. I have aunts and uncles that work for Ford. I have cousins who work for Ford, siblings who work for Ford, and now there's a next generation after me that's working for Ford Motor Company. So we have a long, long history with Ford Motor Company. Most of those workers are hourly workers who have been forced as a condition of employment to be represented by the UAW. And so not only do I work on a full-time basis with Ford, but I'm also a board member for an organization called the Institute for the American Worker. And recently we had a study and published a study that shows that 95% of private sector union workers in the United States never voted for their union. They had to accept it as a condition of employment. And no one in my family, going back to the 50s, ever voted to be in the union. They had to accept it as a condition of employment. So in my case, when I hired in 1996, I knew that I was going to be forced to be represented by the UAW. And for 13 years, paid dues to the UAW as a condition of my employment. In 2009, I realized that, you know what, this union does not represent my values, does not represent what I believe is best for the automobile industry in the United States. And because of political and social activism by the union, I decided, you know what, somebody's got to do something. So in 2010, I started organizing workers around Michigan who felt the same way that I did. And, you know, there's a lot of us that do. We begrudgingly accept the union as our representative because we want to provide for our families, to have a job in the auto industry. And unfortunately, many of us, are forced into speech because of our representatives in the UAW, because of UAW officials who constantly push a political and social agenda that we disagree with. So we started organizing and saying that Michigan really needed to be a right to work state. And through that time, we worked with a lot of organizations here in Michigan, like the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, the National Right to Work Committee, the Michigan Chamber of Commerce, and the list, the Americans for Prosperity. The list go on and on and on of all the groups we worked with to pass legislation in Michigan. And finally, in 2012, we passed a law that made Michigan a right to work state.
So what happened in the few years after? They had about a dozen years right before it was repealed. What was life like?
Well, what's interesting is what the law said is no new contracts, union contracts, could require the payment of dues as a condition of employment for union workers. They still had what's called their union security, which meant that they could force everybody to be represented by them. But the workers were not then forced to pay them dues as a condition of employment. In my case, my contract with Ford did not come due until 2015. So I was still forced to pay dues until September of 2015, even though the law was in place so much earlier. Right. At that time, I withdrew my membership from the UAW and was no longer a UAW member or paid dues to the union. And you know what's interesting is all of the things that the unions came out with and said, right to work will destroy our ability to organize, will make the workplaces very toxic and hostile. None of that came to fruition. We know that unions actually grew in membership when Michigan was a right to work state. And I worked continuously with the same people I worked with before and during peacefully, side by side, right on the line, workers, UAW members and non-UAW members alike. And so everything that the UAW said the world was going to end, none of it was true. And we knew from the beginning that it wasn't going to be true. Workers were finally able to have their rights, their freedoms, and their protections.
So very quickly, what then happened when the repeal occurred? I know it's a short time, but what have been the impacts?
Well, obviously, what's interesting is all private sector union workers in Michigan are going to lose, if they haven't already, all their rights, freedoms, and protections. The majority in Lansing didn't just repeal right to work. They stripped workers of their rights, their freedoms, and their protections. There's a Supreme Court case called Janus versus AFSCME that Janus gives all public sector workers in the United States the right to work. And now all of a sudden, private sector workers are saying, don't we deserve those same rights? Are we somehow less of a person and that we don't deserve those same rights as public sector workers? So, private sector workers need to have an avenue to end this forced dues paying in Michigan.
Shane, same question to you. The before and after the repeal. What was it like during right to work, and then what are you seeing changes now?
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly in Michigan, after right to work was put in place, there was a large phase of growth in Michigan, and it wasn't just the right to work policy; it was other pro business policies. And with right to work being repealed in Michigan, I represent builders and contractors, commercial and industrial. Pretty much none of them are unions, so right to work doesn't directly affect us in that way. It does affect us in that the unions have an ability to now force people to pay dollars into something they disagree with, which are used against us in many cases. But what we deal with at Associated Builders and Contractors is the policy that follows the repeal of right to work. it's not just that simple. And I always like to point out to ABC, the other groups at this table, we are the middle position on this. We are saying you can't be forced to pay into a union. They are saying, yes, you can be forced to pay. If we were actually on the opposite end, we would say it's illegal to collect dues. We've never actually proposed that. That's not our belief. We believe you can join a union if you want to, and if you don't want to, you shouldn't have to pay dues to them. But what comes after right to work? We've seen proposals to crack down on independent contractors, meaning if you like that flexibility to move and to work as a 1099 employee, well, you might not be able to do that in Michigan anymore if they pass this new independent contractor law. They want to create a temp workers bill of rights, which will essentially make it incredibly difficult to become a temp worker. My brother is a shipping and receiving manager at a factory today. He's been there for 25 years. He started as a temp worker.
Right.
And they want to take those rights away.
Let me interrupt real quick. People are familiar with the fight going on in California regarding, independent workers. Is that a similar approach?
The language is exactly what was originally proposed in California before they had to do over 100 exemptions. We don't have the language proposed in Michigan has none of the exemptions. So we can imagine how bad that would be. If you like your DoorDash and your Grubhub and your Uber, well, good luck getting that if this passes. And then they take steps towards things like right now we're dealing with apprenticeship ratios where they want to lower the ratios of the number of apprentices. We have a 500,000 person construction skilled labor worker shortage per year. And in Michigan, they want to say, now you can only have one apprentice trained per every master electrician, meaning that we're going to eliminate 66% of on-the-job training opportunities for apprentices. There was a hearing last week on plumbing. They're proposing 2-to-1. The union representative speaking was asked, well, what is the ratio in your collective bargaining agreement? And his answer was, it's a 4-to-1 ratio. And then he was asked, is that sufficient? And his answer was yes. Well, then why the heck are you here arguing for 50% less apprentices? And then we can take that step towards where they will certainly go in our bills to do in Michigan, which is to repeal the Fair and Open Competition Act and to usher in project labor agreements, which takes that step toward union-only labor in construction. It blocks 85% of Michigan's workforce from working on state-funded jobs. And it says that if you want to work on a state-funded job, you have to sign a collective bargaining agreement for that job. They will argue that, well, you can do that. Well, what company in their right mind is going to pay into the union pension system, into the union healthcare system? And then there are questions on, can I even use my own employees and my apprentices because they didn't go to a union school? They're not under a collective bargaining agreement. Or do I get a pull from the union hall? I would point out, even in California, just last week, Governor Newsom vetoed a PLA bill, which shocked me. But he made the quote, this puts additional cost pressures on our state budget, which we didn't plan for. Every hearing you ever sit in on PLA, they will tell you that it controls costs and keeps costs down. Yet in California, he slipped and said the truth that it adds costs.
So from the big picture, the macroeconomic picture, which the Mackinac Center works on, Steve, what have you seen, and what are the people who support your work and the businesses and so what are they telling you about the world during right to work and after right to work?
Well, it's a great question, and this is something that we've been studying for the better part of 30 years. So I think Michigan's unique in that in a relatively short span of time, we can essentially conduct an A to B test of Michigan pre-right to work and Michigan post-right to work. And the shorthand is essentially, when you look at the economic factors, Michigan was almost universally better off in the 10 years following right to work than the 10 years before. And I've got some statistics that I think are particularly illustrative of that. So when you look at 10 years before right to work and 10 years after, our employment rate after right to work dropped by 2.5%. Well, that means more people are in the workforce, they're more productive, more people have jobs. That's naturally a good thing. When you look at labor force, 10 years before right to work, we were down 7% of the labor force. After right to work, we not only reversed that 7% loss, we were up 2%. So we have more people employed. When you talk about job losses, 2002 to 2012, we lost 500,000 people. When you look at following right to work, we were up 200,000. And that's if you count the COVID spike losses. If you don't, we were up 400,000. When you talk about out-migration, people leaving Michigan and coming back, 120,000 left in the 10 years before, 130,000 came back during right-to-work period. But I think by far the most illustrative stat is inflation-adjusted income. When you look at income before right-to-work in that decade-long period, it was essentially stagnant. It grew by 0.6%. When you look after right-to-work, these inflation-adjusted incomes were up 20%. So you're talking very significant economic impacts that I think we're going to start to see stagnate and reverse now that right-to-work is repealed. But hopefully the legislature will reinstate right-to-work before we see that kind of complete backslide.
And just so people know, the law took effect February, right? So we're just in the first calendar year. But you guys work with data projections. It's not, the numbers you want, which is after it already happened. But what are the smart people saying they expect the impact to be, say, whatever, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years after you've gone back with the repeal of right to work and people no longer have that opportunity?
Well, it's difficult to say because you're talking about economic projections. From a broad standpoint, I think what we're going to see is a stagnation period first, probably the first 2 to 3 years. And then you're going to start to see a backslide. Some of the statistics that we're already seeing are suggesting that we're already moving in that direction. So our unemployment rate is not doing well. It's going up. In terms of recovery from COVID, we are lagging much of the rest of the country. Mm-hmm. And so it's those kinds of statistics where you see that, you see the labor force slowing or in some cases going in the wrong direction, that the economic trends are already happening where, look, if we want to grow Michigan, if we want to attract young talent, if we want to attract businesses to invest in Michigan, right to work is the kind of policy that promotes all of those outcomes. It's not spending hundreds of billions of dollars from corporate welfare funding. It's making the state attractive in the first place so businesses want to locate here.
So one of the arguments that's made, Jared, is that there's nothing free. Your argument that you're making workers free is just not true. That it's the hard work of the unions that are creating opportunity, and that you have people who just want to ride the bandwagon, ride the coattails, and not do the work. So when you hear that argument, what's your answer?
Well, nothing's free, first and foremost. There's always a cost associated.
I know so many people running for public office right now who completely disagree with you, apparently.
Well, it's unfortunate. There's always a cost, and there are always economic pressures on one end or the other, right? The reality is that a better environment for businesses to thrive is going to create jobs, economic activity, and, well, it's going to put money in people's pockets that otherwise wouldn't have been there. And if we take a step back for dates, just so everyone understands dates, 2012, there was a ballot initiative that was put forward in Michigan that would have outlawed any movement that Michigan legislature citizens could have taken to make Michigan a right-to-work state. That ballot initiative was defeated pretty substantially. The legislature came back, polling suggested that the appetite in Michigan was for more freedoms and more choice in the workplace. And coincidentally, that's where we land nationally right now. People want to make the best decisions for themselves and their family without influence. Whether you are talking about people working in ports or whether you're talking about people working in the construction industry or the service industry, everyone wants freedoms to make the best choice for them and their family, period. So Michigan became a right-to-work state in 2012. We've had 10 years of operating that way, where employees had that option and choice no matter where they worked or what their employer or who their employer was. Those opportunities and choices have been stripped away from them as of last year. So now Michigan is a non-right-to-work state in 2013. More money is going to be coming out of families' pocketbooks and checking accounts than it was 2 years ago. There's no question. At a time when families can least afford it, they're going to be subjected to having to be mandated to give up some of their paycheck to the union if they work in an environment where there is a union. It is also going to pave the way for more union activity to come into a place of business and start promising the sun and everything else to employees. Their mission is dues monies that they can turn around and use and spend in a variety of different scenarios and locations. Much of it is going to be political. The reality is that the Center for Independent Employees is not pro-union, and we are not anti-union. What we are is we are pro-worker, and we want workers to have opportunities to decide and do what's best for them and their family. A right-to-work scenario is great, but I will tell you that the Center for Independent Employees, our work commences in right-to-work states and non-right-to-work states. If employees want another option, the option that the Center for Independent Employees put forward and helps people through is decertification. So decertification is the next option for Michigan employees. If you want out from underneath the union, or you want to stop the union from organizing your shop because you enjoy the benefits in the workplace and having a direct relationship with your employer without a third party coming in and telling everybody what they should do, decertification is the way. CIE is the way to help you. We provide free legal aid, and we will guide you through that process so that you can have your own internal election on whether you want representation in the workplace or not. That's what CIE does.
So I want to ask, we've got some questions coming in from people on the stream, but also have questions here in the room. I want to ask more about that big picture of what happened. What do you anticipate happening from the transition? For example, are you already seeing businesses changing what they're going to do in the future because right to work has been repealed? Shane, you want to start that? Then I want to come and ask you that same question.
Well, again, on the ABC side of things, I mean, our members aren't union members. I think for us, it's the boldness that we see after repealing right to work to move on to the next policy, the next policy that are direct attacks on workers. It's attacks on their abilities to be an independent contractor, to enter the workforce as a temp worker, to 85% of construction workers in Michigan are working for non-union companies. There was language in the budget that said, and it got removed from the budget, thank goodness. I think the unions realized how damaging it was to them, that you couldn't work on a state project if you didn't go through a DOL apprenticeship. It didn't say if you're not. It was retroactive. So an AWS certified welder, that's the gold standard for welding. That is not a DOL apprenticeship. I'm not sure where you would find a welder in the state of Michigan qualified to work on a state-funded project. An HVAC technician that goes to a community college. And we're paying for people's community college in Michigan now. We're paying for a community college that doesn't qualify you to work on a state project. Like, where did we come up with these ideas? Luckily, that language got pulled, but these are direct attacks on workers, and that's what we see in our industry following the repeal of right to work are the rest of the agenda coming in, the money to follow it, and to push that agenda through.
So, Terry, for the average rank and file worker who's maybe open to joining the union if it makes sense, but would rather not if it doesn't make sense, what's been their response to the repeal?
Well, obviously, the auto industry has been union organized since the 30s. I think most employees just take it for granted that they're going to be forced to be unionized and represented by an outside third party for as long as they work there. There's not a whole lot of activists involved in the rank and file, although behind the scenes they're very involved and talk to me all the time about what they would like to see. But what's interesting, I think, in the auto industry is you have a union that obviously supports one side of the aisle over the other, and an administration and a candidate over one side of the aisle. However, what we're seeing is a push for EV mandates, which is really affecting jobs in the auto industry. And we have a union president right now in the UAW who, whether you like him or you don't like him, is vastly political in his stances. And unfortunately, all those workers are forced to pay dues to the union as a condition of employment. And they're forced into that speech, and they give up their right of freedom of association or the freedom to not associate.
So a lot of our writers who write about right to work and labor law focus on the economic side. But I want to ask the other three of you about what was raised, which is politics too. Does it impact workers? Are they bothered by this idea that you join a union and suddenly your paycheck's involved in politics, left or right? Or is that just something that pundits like to talk about? Or do you hear it from people you talk to, Jared?
We do hear that side of things, but I guess what I would say is let me be real clear. It's more about workers having a choice of where they want to, who they want to belong to, or what organization they want to belong to, without being mandated or forced to do so. The secondary and tertiary effects are certainly, where do their dues monies go?
Right.
The reality is that they don't go back into the actual worker. They're not invested 100% back into the worker. They are, in many cases, there are state associations, national associations that share the pot. If you look at teachers, local, their local union will get $20, the state union gets 30, and the feds get 60. I mean, they're sending funds up the pipeline versus concentrating at where the workers are.
Well, for example, in the state of New Hampshire, we just happened to see an article about this. The average teacher salary is around $80,000. A union head makes $250,000 plus other non-named benefits. So it's kind of a different spread. Back to the economics. One of the arguments that people who support encouraging unionization, or the PRO Act, which would make it illegal to have right to work, they say that if you look at the net efficiency, because the union provides training services, et cetera, that it's a winner to have that. Does the Mackinac Center have any data? And I'm also curious, are there any history lessons from other states, say in the Great Lakes region or the Rust Belt from 2012, when you started making the change, to today, that would be comparable? Not that anyone's paying attention, for example, to the state of Pennsylvania. It hasn't been in the news at all lately, but any comparisons?
Well, I'll start with the second part of that question first. And I think the best comparisons that we can see on the right to work perspective come from when you take a look at what are called border counties. And my colleague, Michael Fave, has done a study on this, so has Harvard University, and they were within a percentage point of each other. But in both instances, those studies took a look at the counties in non-right to work states next to the counties in right to work states. And they looked at share of manufacturing employment. Essentially, if you have a borderline with two communities that are very similar to each other, you've essentially controlled for climate, for basically everything but your legal environment. And what both studies found was that over 25% of the growth happened in the right to work state in manufacturing, share of manufacturing employment, compared to the non-right to work state. Essentially, we're draining the non-right to work state to build things in the right to work state. So we know that happens. In terms of overall environment, right to work, as I mentioned, has economic effects. But I actually want to agree with Jared here, where the real issue here is coercion. Regardless of whether you like what the union stands for, you don't like what the union stands for, be it in the workplace or politically, workers need to have the choice. Right to work gives you closer to that choice. You still have no choice but to accept the union representation. As Terry put it, whether you like Sean Fade or not, you have to fund the UAW. Right to work at least allows you to step off that line, and while they still negotiate your contract, you at least have the option to say, I personally want to make a separate decision. Sometimes that's a political decision. Sometimes that's an economic decision. But we think that workers need that ability to make that choice, and that's what right to work gives them.
I had a question from one of the people on the stream about worker mobility, basically asking, isn't worker mobility the solution? Could you explain to me what they mean by worker mobility? Is someone smarter than me? And then how does it play into this right to work conversation?
Sure. I don't know exactly what they're referencing, although I'm guessing that what they're talking about is the ability of the worker to pick one job and leave another. And certainly that helps. But if you raised the PRO Act earlier, and another thing that comes along with that is what's known as sectoral bargaining. This is a big push at the top level where you take entire industries and unions bargain with an industry group. So let's use the Michigan industry of auto, right? You're talking, you get Stellantis, you get GM, you get Ford in the room. They negotiate for the entire industry, and then that's going to be binding on everybody. Well, that creates a mobility issue because if Volkswagen is part of this negotiation too, and everybody is bound by it, even though you have varying, state laws, we have plants that are unionized, plants that aren't, you create a situation where if I'm an auto worker and I don't want a union, I can't go anywhere anymore. It doesn't matter what the state laws become. So the real issue here from a mobility perspective is when you start talking about the impacts of right to work and PRO Act and sectoral bargaining, you eliminate even more of the competitive factors that allow people to make the choices to go to a plan, to leave a company, or pick up a different career.
And so your members, are they, in the construction industry, are they seeing mobile workers? I mean, is it the case that workers are stuck? Do they have options? Or is there a competition for skilled labor that means they're going to have plenty of choices if they don't like their boss?
In Michigan right now, there's huge competition for skilled labor because of the shortage of skilled labor. And in an ABC company, there can be plenty of movement. And that's where we say we support all tracks to the skilled trades. If you want to go to a union trade school, that's fine. If you go to a community college, that's fine. If you go through Michigan Works, an ABC affiliated school, that's fine. What we want to make sure is still there is that you aren't limited based on what apprenticeship program you went to. And what we're seeing in Michigan is this movement toward, well, if you didn't go to a union apprenticeship program, you're incredibly limited on where you can work and what you can do in the future. And that's just completely wrong. We have this entire narrative for the last 15, 20 years that you don't have to go to college and skilled trades are a great opportunity. Nobody says to them, but if you don't go to the right skilled trades program, we're not going to let you do that job. It's absolutely ridiculous. And like I said, we support all paths to the skilled trade. If somebody called us and said, we're thinking of going to a union trade school, I'd say good for you. And if you do, and you come work for an ABC company that's non-union afterwards, that's great. We'll take you.
A question for the table. What industries are most sensitive to this change in Michigan's law from right to work to now end of right to work?
I can start. I think the obvious answer to that is the auto industry, but it's really any private sector industry. So when we're talking labor law, there's public sector, which is government workers, and those workers have right to work protections as a matter of constitutional law. Right. Terry mentioned Janus. That's a First Amendment right. All public sector, your teachers, your fire, your police, your state government employees, in anywhere throughout the country have those protections. In Michigan, when you take away right to work, the people that you're affecting are the private industries. These are the people that you're forcing to at least pay agency fees to not get fired for not supporting the union. So any of your private sector employers, some of your hospital systems, depending on who owns them, your auto industry is a major one, manufacturing industry, those industries that you think of around Michigan, around Detroit, those are the ones especially that are going to see the biggest impacts.
And I understand that, but for example, the service workers union folks, they're in a low skill job. And so plenty of people can do them, as opposed to the higher skilled workers that you need in the trades, et cetera. Is there an industry that the closing door of losing right to work is going to have more impact on their workers because of the disparity of the workers' place in the marketplace or the skills, or anything that I don't know about?
Jim? I would say it's any private sector worker.
Right. But there's not a continuum where they're more sensitive or less sensitive to losing this right to work opportunity?
Well, I mean, I would say there are going to be dues discrepancies amongst industries, right? You talked about low skilled versus high skilled. The amount of funds that come out of someone's pocketbook is going to be different, right? But ultimately, it's everyone in the private sector now in Michigan won't have a choice of whether they want to belong or not belong to a union. They're going to be forced to do so if there's a union that's in place. And the reality is that none of this matters to CIE because CIE helps employees that want out from under the union.
Sure.
So whether it's right to work, non-right to work, whether it's political implications one way or another, it does not matter to us. This is a worker decision. There is a group within a bargaining unit in a company that doesn't want a union. They call CIE, and we help them get out from under the union. It is pretty cut and dry, and they have an option through decertification moving forward. If the Michigan legislature does not make Michigan a right to work state, that's the only other option if you want out of the union.
So I have a question from the Josiah Bartlett Center, which is the think tank in New Hampshire. What would it mean for the state economy and economic opportunity if New Hampshire became the only right to work state in the Northeast? Any thoughts from think tank, your fellow think tanker?
I'm not a site selector. What's that?
What would you say?
I was a site selector,
right?
And I was working in the upper Northeast of this country. Mm-hmm. every single person that came to me looking for a place to locate would go to New Hampshire.
Right.
Absolutely. That is the one place I would recommend. And if you look at site selectors and if they are asked, where should I put my operations? Where should I invest?
Right.
One of the top 2 things that come out of site selectors' mouth is, are they a worker freedom state? Do they give opportunities for workers to decide what they want to do as far as belong or not belong to a union? Basically, are they a right to work state or not? That is one of the top things that are asked. If the answer to that is no, they're not a right to work state, I would move on. I would find one that gave the most freedoms to workers.
I'll echo that, and I'll add a little bit to it. If we're running with the assumption that New Hampshire is the only state that has a right to work law that's hypothetical, my advice would be buy land, particularly commercial land in New Hampshire, because you're not going to have enough for all of the companies that want to relocate to you.
So when the right to work law started to take effect, what kind of businesses made those decisions about Michigan? I'm saying once your right to work law was up and running, were there some industries or business, like obviously the car manufacturers, that they're already here, but any other interesting stories from the right to work era that you think are kind of telling?
I mean, from my perspective, I think the macro view is that investment in manufacturing increased substantially.
Did it?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's hard to nail down one particular company, because
Sure.
a company just writes you off for not having the worker freedom that they want. They're not going to announce that to the state because they don't move. So you've got to look at where did the manufacturing go? And I think that what the 2 studies I mentioned earlier show is kind of that macro level. Okay, we can look at the data in the aggregate and we can really see a statistically significant movement here. So that's what I would point to rather than any one story.
And what about the workers during that period? We're hearing people like, oh my gosh, they're hiring here. There's a new company moving here. Was that kind of the buzz during the right to work decade?
Well, I think there was. I mean, we know that Michigan's economy did much better during about the 11 years of right to work than it did before that. And there was much more opportunity for workers to come from out of state into Michigan. And I remember I think it was called Chief Executive Magazine, used to come out with their list of top states that companies have said that they would like to move to. And usually the vast majority of the top 10 states were right to work states. It just gives more opportunities for workers in the states when it's a right to work state.
So one of the questions we have is, what is the solution for Michigan, in your opinion, across the board? And I want to add another element to that. And my goal now, Jared, is to make you uncomfortable by being far too political. But we cover politics as well at InsideSources. And so what we see is you have the story of the longshoremen strike. And people are learning a lot that they don't know about. And nothing against law. I used to live in Charleston, South Carolina, one of the tiny unions in a large right to work state were the longshoremen. And they were great guys. We had beers with them, terrific. But you found out how much they were making. You'd see the lineup of these huge trucks with the mega tires. And you're like, these guys, compared to the low income state of South Carolina, holy moly. Now we have the news of the top guys earning $800,000, $900,000. People are hearing about the wages that are being turned down in the strike. Does that create an opportunity to get people who kind of have worker 1950 union, kind of that, kind of eye shade over this topic, to take a more, these are the real numbers. Maybe there is some room here. Is this an opportunity to get people to relitigate right to work? And that's questions for everybody. What's the solution, and is there an opportunity today?
Well, I mean, short of becoming a right to work state in Michigan, I think the solution truly is putting the power back in employees' hands and ultimately allowing them to decide what's best for them.
But is that fight winnable again, do you think?
Well, again, I don't know as though in the near term, Michigan is going to go back to a right to work state. I don't see that. And I don't even need a crystal ball. If you can look at and the reason being is that if you look at who controls the legislature and the executive office in Michigan, the majority right now is not a right to work friendly group. So it is not going to happen in the legislature. I would advocate and argue that the solution is decertification. If you're an employee that doesn't want the union, and there's a group of employees that you work with that don't want a union or don't want representation and want to have a direct relationship, decertification is the way to go. that is the solution for Michigan. Doesn't matter what industry you're in. If you went out from underneath the union, CI will can help you.
Jumping in on the longshoreman strike and is there a legislative fix? Well, the president was quoted as saying, well, I'm not a fan of Taft-Hartley or something.
Right.
Well, I don't believe in Taft-Hartley. Well, Taft-Hartley does allow some degree of federal action.
Could you explain real quickly what it is?
Yeah, so Taft-Hartley is the 1947 amendment to the National Labor Relations Act, which is the act that governs the vast majority of private sector employment in the country. And one of the president's abilities is to essentially call those workers back in to eliminate a temporary strike. Well, the president has indicated that he's not going to do that, but there's a bigger story going on here that I don't think has gotten the attention it needs to get, which is that the National Labor Relations Act is at serious risk of being found unconstitutional. There are 3 or 4 cases out of the Fifth Circuit. SpaceX, Amazon are 2 of the companies there. Trader Joe's also has a case similar to this, where, not to get into too much into legal weeds, the argument is essentially because the National Labor Relations Board, which is responsible for administering the National Labor Relations Act, is insulated from presidential removal. The entire structure of the act is unconstitutional. The Fifth Circuit, a Western District of Texas court has already basically said that's what it's going to hold. There are cases on appeal at the Fifth Circuit. If they're upheld, this looks like a Supreme Court issue. And if SCOTUS ultimately comes down and says that's correct, someone is going to have to look at making changes to the National Labor Relations Act. And one of those changes could be a national system where right to work is the law. It's no longer a state issue. So I think there's potential for a legislative solution, but it's not in the near future. Let's put it that way.
And what about the argument that people are re-looking at the premise of union labor? I mean, there is a lot of emotion. We have a lot of emotion invested in this culturally. It's part of the mythos of America. And obviously, labor unions played a very important role early on in the days of industrialization. But people have also, we've had back and forth on this, which is why you were able to pass a right to work law. Is there a shifting look, particularly as you mentioned, independent contractors and gig workers? I mean, somebody who said shut down Uber and Grubhub and you can't do, if you do that, my children will starve. The only way they can access food apparently is through their phone. So is that having an impact? The dynamic nature of our economy now having an impact on how people view unions?
I think it will have an impact, but unfortunately, I don't think it'll have an impact until it happens and until the law passes. I think a lot of people don't understand what that law would do. And California is a good example of that. They passed it, and then they had to make 109, I think was the number, exemptions to the law, basically admitting to themselves, well, this is a stupid law, and we have to exempt 109 different industries from this. So my fear is that doesn't happen until the law passes. Going back to the last point, though, you said let the workers decide. And I think the comment was made earlier, and it might have been you as well, Jared, that only a very small percentage of people have ever voted on their own unionization. And I agree, let the workers decide. And I think the other side has showed they're scared to death of that, which is why the NLRB is coming in and changing rules to make it easier to unionize, to change the election process, and to make sure that you don't actually have a conversation around, is this a good thing or a bad thing? You just get these cards signed, hurry up and do it before anybody can think about this. So I think that they would agree with us that, yeah, letting the workers decide is the best way to solve this, and we don't want them to do that.
So Terry, what's it like to be a new worker and you come in and people are talking to you about, particularly during the right to work when you weren't necessarily going to join? What was that like to be a walking in the door, newly minted worker at a unionized workplace?
Well, I think what's interesting is there's a lot of times a new worker will come in and they're never told that they have the option of whether or not they want to join the union. They're just handed a union card and said, sign this. But what I see in the future for workers is, what's happening with a possible case going to SCOTUS, as Steve was talking about, is very interesting, very exciting. But it's not in the short term, as he said. It's a long term thing. What do I see on the federal side outside of SCOTUS as far as legislation to help workers? I don't see much in the future happening. Obviously, in Michigan, as was said, we don't really see any hope that the Michigan legislature or the executive branch will help workers. They're not worker friendly. They're friendly to union officials, which is very different than being friendly to the rank and file in workers. So I think the conclusion is for workers is that they have to know that there is an option out there. There is friends out there in the Center for Independent Employees. They have very successful cases. They have good stories to tell, and it's definitely an option that I think workers should take a look at.
Well, that seems like a great place to wrap up the conversation. Does anyone have anything that they'd like to add? That's it?
That's it.
I want everyone to know this entire meeting was AI. None of us were actually, no, I'm kidding. No, but I do want to thank everybody here at the Mackinac Center and the embassy we had a technical issue and it was a little touch and go there, but hardworking, smart people, non-unionized smart people helped us get that through. So thank you all for participating. Inside Sources will have coverage of this event, of course, and we will also have the audio, video, and the transcript available. So if you're working on a news story or a report and you want to use some of the data here, we will have that at InsideSources.com. We'll also be able to happy to connect you with everyone here. And I know, Jared, you're not shy about talking. How can people reach CIE?
Well, the easiest way, let me just give you the website. It's centerforindependentemployees.org. Our phone number is there, email address is there. Feel free to contact us. You can find out what it is we do. We have explanation on our website of the whole decertification process.
And we will also happily put you in touch with anyone who's here as well. You can reach us as always at news@InsideSources.com. Fascinating conversation, perfectly timely, and we appreciate all of you being part of it. With Inside Sources, I'm Michael Graham.